The community hall in Jacksonville, Florida, was filled to capacity. Rows of chairs stretched across the polished wooden floor, the air buzzing with hushed conversations and the occasional scrape of metal chair legs against the ground. Families sat together, murmuring among themselves, while retirees exchanged quiet nods. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation. This wasn't just any town hall meeting. At the front of the room, Donald Trump stood behind a simple wooden podium. His familiar presence commanded the space, yet tonight, something was different. Gone was the electrifying energy of his usual rallies, the roaring chants and boisterous cheers. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity among the crowd. This wasn't just about policies or politics. There was something unspoken lingering in the air, a feeling that tonight might be about something more. Among the sea of faces, one stood out, not for its prominence, but for its quiet intensity. Seated near the front was Ella, a 9-year-old girl with wide, searching eyes. Her small hands clutched an old leather-bound Bible to her chest, its cover worn smooth with time. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman of unshakable faith who had whispered prayers over this very book for decades. Tonight, Ella carried it with the same reverence, holding on to it as if it were a tether to something far greater than herself. Beside her, her mother sat with an encouraging hand resting gently on her knee. She had seen the way Ella had been rehearsing her question, scribbling it in notebooks during recess, murmuring it under her breath at night. This wasn't just a question of curiosity, it was one that had been weighing on her soul. "You can ask him," her mother had whispered before they left home, "but only if you're brave enough, and only if you truly mean it." Ella had nodded, though her heart had pounded in her chest. Now, sitting in this vast room filled with strangers, that courage felt like it was slipping away. She tightened her grip on her Bible, stealing a glance at the towering figure of Trump at the podium. He had begun speaking now, his voice measured and firm. He talked about America's future, his vision, and the progress he had made. Occasionally, the audience clapped or nodded in agreement, but the energy was different from the rallies he was used to. The cheers were softer, the responses more restrained. Something was missing. Ella listened, waiting. Her fingers curled around the edges of her Bible as she held on to her question, waiting for the right moment. Then, at last, the floor was open for questions. A line quickly formed. Adults eager to ask about local policies, national concerns, and even a few compliments on his signature red tie. One by one, they stepped forward, their voices confident, their concerns laid out clearly. Ella shrank slightly into her seat, her tiny frame almost disappearing in the crowd. Then, her mother gave her a gentle nudge. It was now or never. Ella took a deep breath, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. She stood slowly, her legs wobbly beneath her. At first, no one noticed, but as she inched forward, the murmurs around her began to fade. People turned. A small girl with an oversized Bible clutched tightly to her chest. Curious glances flickered in her direction. Whispers rippled through the crowd. By the time she reached the front of the line, the entire room had fallen silent. Donald Trump's gaze landed on her, his usual commanding expression softening ever so slightly. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked. His voice, though still firm, carried an unexpected gentleness. Ella swallowed hard. Her knuckles turned white against the Bible's edges. Then, with a voice that trembled, but refused to break, she asked the question that had been echoing in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The moment the words left her lips, the air in the room changed. The audience froze. The murmurs stopped. The creaking of chairs stilled. Even the faint sounds of cars passing outside the building seemed to disappear. For the first time that evening, Donald Trump did not have an immediate answer. He stared at Ella, then at the Bible in her hands, and something in his entire demeanor shifted. A hush fell over the room. For a man known for his rapid-fire responses, Donald Trump remained uncharacteristically silent. He studied the small girl before him, her tiny hands clutching the old Bible as though it were her lifeline. The weight of her question hung in the air, pressing down on the room like an unseen force. From the crowd, all eyes were fixed on the podium. Some faces held curiosity, others held surprise. But most of all, there was something deeper, a quiet recognition that this moment was different. This wasn't just another question about policy or national issues. This was personal. Trump's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the podium, tapping once, twice, his usual signs of quick thinking. But no rehearsed speech came. No well-worn talking points. Instead, he exhaled slowly as if steadying himself. "That's a big question," he finally said, his voice lower than before. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." A murmur rippled through the audience. It was rare, almost unheard of for Trump to admit uncertainty. For years he had built a reputation of unwavering confidence, a man who always had an answer, always had a plan. Yet here he was, pausing, reflecting. Ella, however, did not waver. Her wide brown eyes remained locked on his, waiting. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, whispering the question to herself before bed, scribbling it in the margins of her notebook during recess. She wanted the real answer. Not the polished version, not the political one. And something about her quiet determination moved him. Trump glanced back at the Bible in her small hands, its leather cover worn from years of loving use. He had seen many Bibles before, given many speeches in churches, but this felt different. "This book," he said, nodding toward it. "It meant everything to my mother. She read it every day. She used to tell me that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you feel like you're going to fall." His words lingered, hanging in the air. Ella's grip on the Bible tightened. Trump took another breath, his gaze sweeping across the audience. He could feel their anticipation, the collective pulse of the room as they waited. This wasn't just about answering a child's question anymore. It was about something bigger. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I remember sitting in church, staring at the stained glass windows, and wondering if God was even listening to me. If he really cared. If he was really there." A few heads in the audience nodded slightly. They understood. Trump shifted slightly, resting his hand more firmly on the podium. "The truth is, there were times in my life when I didn't think he was," he admitted. "Times when I was angry, when I felt like I had been left on my own." His voice was steady, but there was something raw in it, something unpolished, something real. Ella tilted her head slightly, absorbing every word. The silence in the room was profound now. Even the smallest sounds, chairs creaking, a cough muffled behind a hand, seemed to have disappeared. Someone in the crowd exhaled audibly, as if they had been holding their breath. Trump leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if speaking not to an audience, but to Ella alone. "Faith," he said, "isn't about always knowing. It's about believing, even when you don't see the whole picture. Even when everything in you says it's not there." A single tear slipped down Ella's cheek. And for the first time that night, Donald Trump truly had the room. For a long moment, Donald Trump stood in thoughtful silence. His usual quick, confident responses had given way to something deeper, something unspoken. His gaze drifted beyond the podium, beyond the audience, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of the community hall. Then, with a quiet breath, he spoke again. "When I was your age, Ella," he said, his voice carrying a rare softness, "faith wasn't something I thought much about. My parents took me to church every Sunday. It was just what we did. We sat in the pews, listened to the sermons, bowed our heads when we were supposed to." He paused, a faint smile flickering across his lips. "But I remember looking up at those big stained glass windows, watching how the sunlight would pour through, turning the whole church into this glow of reds and blues and golds. And I'd sit there, wondering, was God really listening to me?" A few heads in the audience nodded slightly. Some smiled. They had asked themselves the same thing once, long ago. Trump leaned against the podium, his voice lowering slightly as if revealing a long-kept memory. "I wasn't a bad kid," he continued, "but I was restless. I wanted answers. I wanted proof. I wanted to see something, to hear something, something that told me, without a doubt, that God was real." His fingers tapped lightly against the wood. "My father, he was a strong man, a man of faith, but he didn't talk about it much. He lived it. And I'll never forget something he told me one night when I asked him, 'How do you know God is real?' The room was completely still. He said, 'Don, faith is like a ladder. You don't always see the top, but you climb anyway, one step at a time.'" Trump let the words settle. "I didn't understand it back then. I thought it was just one of those things parents say to keep kids quiet," he admitted with a small chuckle. A few in the audience smiled, the tension in the room easing just slightly. But as I got older, life started throwing challenges at me. I faced failures, I faced losses, and there were moments when I didn't know if I could keep going. His expression grew more serious, his gaze scanning the faces in the crowd. In those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he had given up on me altogether. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not in judgment, but in understanding. Trump exhaled, shifting slightly. But looking back, I think those were the moments when faith mattered most. When you're standing on a step and you can't see what's ahead, but you climb anyway, because deep down, something tells you, keep going. Ella's small fingers relaxed against her Bible. She wasn't just listening, she was absorbing every word. Trump looked back at her, and for the first time that evening his expression was almost paternal. God to me, he said, his voice steady, is that reason to keep climbing. Even when the ladder shakes, even when you think it's going to break, even when you don't know if you can take another step. For the first time that evening, Ella smiled, a small, knowing smile. And in that moment, something in the room shifted. A heavy silence filled the room. Donald Trump's expression changed, his usual confidence replaced with something quieter, something almost vulnerable. He took a slow breath, his fingers pressing against the edge of the podium as if steadying himself. There was a time in my life, he began, his voice lower, steadier, when I thought I had everything figured out. I had ambition, I had drive, and I had plans for the future. But there was one moment, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had. The audience leaned forward, sensing that whatever he was about to say was different, more personal. Trump's gaze flickered across the room, then settled on Ella again. My brother Michael, he said, the name itself carrying weight. He was one of the best people I've ever known, a good man, a kind man, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make it feel lighter, warmer. He had a way of making people feel seen, heard, something I don't think I ever fully appreciated when we were younger. His voice softened, but Michael struggled. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. A ripple of stillness ran through the audience. Some had heard about Trump's brother before, but never like this. Never in a moment so raw. I'll never forget the day we lost him, Trump continued. His usual commanding tone had faded, replaced by something heavier. I was angry. Angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. Ella's grip on her Bible tightened. I couldn't understand it, he admitted. If God was real, if he was good, then why? Why would he take someone like Michael, someone so full of life, so full of potential, and leave me behind? His words settled over the room like a weight. I didn't talk about it much back then. I didn't know how to, but for a long time after that, I turned away from faith. I told myself I didn't need it, that if God existed, he had already turned his back on me. He shook his head slightly, his jaw tightening before he exhaled, but then something changed. The room was utterly still, waiting. Trump looked at Ella, his gaze softer than before. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, he said. But one night, I saw Michael's face in my mind, that same big, goofy smile he always had, and I heard him say, "Don't be angry, you've got work to do." A shiver seemed to run through the audience. Trump let the words settle before continuing. I don't know if it was him, or if it was just something I needed to hear. But that moment, it stayed with me, and it made me realize something. He took a step back, his gaze sweeping the room. Faith, he said, isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when we can't see it, even when it hurts. The silence in the room was profound. Ella blinked up at him, her small face solemn, and then, ever so slowly, her shoulders relaxed. Trump's eyes met hers. So when you ask me what God means to me, he said, I'll tell you this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard, even when I don't have all the answers. Because faith is what keeps us climbing. And for the first time that evening, Ella truly understood. The room remained silent, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of Trump's words. The loss of his brother, the anger, the questions. Everyone in the audience could feel the gravity of the moment. And yet, in that same silence, there was something else. A quiet anticipation. A feeling that there was more to the story. Trump inhaled slowly, his gaze steady, as if choosing his next words carefully. For a long time after Michael's death, he admitted, I carried that anger with me. I buried it deep, but it was always there, and I told myself I didn't need faith. I told myself I could do everything on my own. He paused, gripping the edge of the podium. But here's the thing about life. It has a way of humbling you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Trump nodded slightly, his expression unreadable for a moment before he continued. There were nights when I felt like I had everything, and still I felt empty. I had success, I had power, but something was missing, and no matter how much I achieved, that feeling never really went away. His fingers tapped against the wood, a faint rhythm as he gathered his thoughts. And then one night, I had this dream. The crowd was still, listening intently. In the dream, I was standing at the bottom of a long, winding staircase. I couldn't see the top, just darkness stretching above me. And every time I took a step, the stairs creaked under my feet, like they could break at any moment. Trump exhaled. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to stay where I was. But then, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Ella's grip on her Bible loosened slightly. It was Michael's voice, Trump said, his expression softening. Keep climbing, Dawn, he said, even when you're afraid, even when you don't know what's waiting at the top. A shiver seemed to pass through the crowd. Trump's voice grew quieter. When I woke up, I sat there in the dark, just thinking, and I realized something I had been running from for years. He looked directly at Ella now. Faith, he said, isn't about knowing exactly what's at the top of the staircase. It's about climbing anyway, one step at a time. The words hung in the air, untouched by doubt or hesitation. Trump glanced around the room, seeing the faces of men and women who had come expecting a typical town hall, but were now caught up in something much more personal. I started looking at my life differently after that, he admitted. I realized that all the times I thought I was alone, I wasn't. I just wasn't paying attention. A few people in the audience nodded. Others simply sat in thoughtful silence. I still don't have all the answers, Trump said, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know this: God doesn't always show up in big, miraculous ways. Sometimes he shows up in a memory, in a dream, in a small, quiet moment that reminds you to keep going. Ella blinked up at him, her small face thoughtful. Trump gave her a small, almost knowing smile. And sometimes, he said, he shows up in the questions of a little girl with a Bible. For the first time, Ella smiled back. The silence that followed Trump's words wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken thoughts, quiet realizations, and something deeper that couldn't quite be put into words. Ella held onto her Bible, her fingers no longer gripping it in nervousness but resting on it as if it were a quiet reassurance. She had asked the question, and she had received an answer. Maybe not the kind she had expected, but one that felt real. But before the moment could settle, another voice broke the silence. A man near the back of the hall slowly rose to his feet. His build was sturdy, his face lined with the kind of hard-earned wisdom that comes from years of labor. He looked like someone who had worked with his hands all his life, a mechanic perhaps, or a carpenter. A man who had seen struggle, but rarely spoken about it. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the quiet room. Mr. Trump, he began, his tone careful, deliberate. I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. I hear you talk about anger, about doubt, and about hope. And it makes me wonder. He paused for a beat. Do you think we've all been too afraid to admit we're struggling? The question lingered in the air, touching something unspoken in the crowd. Trump's eyes met the man's, and for a moment, he simply studied him. Then, instead of answering right away, he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the weight of what had just been asked. You know, he finally said, his voice lower, more measured, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Others glanced at one another, as if silently wondering if they had been carrying the same fear. Faith isn't easy, Trump continued. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes, it feels like you're shouting into the void, hoping someone hears you. His gaze swept the crowd, settling momentarily on a woman in the third row who had been sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But here's the truth, he said. Faith isn't about being perfect, it's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers. The man who had asked the question nodded slowly, then sat back down. A murmur of quiet agreement rippled through the room. Then, unexpectedly, Ella's small voice rose again. "My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds," she said, her words clear and steady despite her small frame. "You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." The room stilled. Trump turned toward her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Something almost like admiration. "Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman," he said. Ella nodded, her expression solemn. "She used to say that God is always listening, even when we don't hear him." Trump exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "And she was right," he said. "Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see yet." The energy in the room shifted. No longer just an audience listening to a speech, but a group of people sharing something real. It was no longer about politics, no longer about speeches or applause. It was about connection. And as Trump stood there, looking out at a crowd that had come expecting one thing, but had found something entirely different, he knew this conversation was far from over. The room felt different now. It was no longer just a town hall, no longer just another political gathering. Something had shifted. An invisible thread now connected the people in that space, woven together by a conversation they hadn't expected to have. Trump stood at the podium, his gaze steady on Ella, the small girl who had unknowingly changed the course of the evening. The Bible in her hands seemed almost too big for her, yet she held it with a quiet certainty. Across the room, a woman with silver hair slowly raised her hand. Her face was lined with time, her eyes filled with something fragile yet strong. When she spoke, her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of her words. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her fingers clutching the hem of her sweater. "He was my best friend, and since he passed, I've been angry at God. I've been so angry." Her voice caught, and for a brief moment she looked down. Then she lifted her eyes again, this time braver. "I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" The room held its breath. Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice softer than before. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. Sometimes it drifts, sometimes it feels far away, but it waits for you, and sometimes, in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, it comes back." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. Ella shifted slightly in her seat, then turned to Trump once more. "My grandma used to say something about that," she murmured, almost to herself. Trump tilted his head, intrigued. "What did she say?" Ella hesitated for only a second before speaking. "She said faith is like a candle," she said softly. "Sometimes the flame flickers, sometimes it even goes out, but if you hold on to the wick, it can always be lit again." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Trump's lips pressed together, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly he nodded. "She was right," he said. And she knew something a lot of people forget. Faith isn't about never struggling. It's about choosing to keep the wick even when you don't feel the fire. Ella's fingers brushed over the worn cover of her grandmother's Bible, as if absorbing the truth of those words. The emotion in the room swelled. People weren't just listening anymore. They were feeling. A man in the audience wiped his eyes discreetly. Another woman clutched her husband's hand a little tighter. A silver-haired widow pressed a trembling hand to her heart. And then, Trump turned back to Ella. "You know," he said, a small, knowing smile crossing his face, "your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked to meet." Ella's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but this time they weren't from sadness. She straightened her spine, holding on to the Bible not out of fear, but out of love. "She would have liked you too," she whispered. And just like that, the entire night changed. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about something bigger. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air in the room was thick, not with tension, but with something else entirely, something deeper. Something that couldn't quite be put into words. Donald Trump stood at the podium, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He wasn't just looking at them, he was seeing them. The people in this room weren't just voters, supporters, or spectators. They were seekers. Some sought answers, others sought reassurance. And some, like Ella, sought something even greater, a reason to believe. He exhaled slowly before speaking, his voice quieter than before, but no less firm. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I've spent a lot of years standing in rooms like this, speaking to crowds, answering questions, but I don't think I've ever been asked one as important as the one Ella asked me tonight." A faint smile crossed his face as he turned toward her. "Because the truth is, when we ask what God means to us, we're really asking who we are when no one else is looking." A murmur of understanding rippled through the audience. "We live in a world," Trump continued, "where we're always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We think success, power, or money will fill the gaps, but they don't. The real answers, the ones that truly matter, are the ones that make us uncomfortable. The ones that make us ask, what do I believe in? What do I stand for?" He paused, letting the words settle. Then, his gaze returned to Ella. "Thank you for reminding me of that, Ella," he said sincerely. "You're wiser than most adults I know." A gentle wave of applause filled the room, not for Trump alone, but for the moment itself. Ella wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress. The tears were gone, replaced by something else, a quiet pride. She looked up at her mother, who smiled at her with glistening eyes of her own. But Trump wasn't finished. His expression shifted slightly, as if preparing to leave the crowd with one final thought. "You know," he said, stepping forward, "we're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences, they're louder than ever. But faith has the power to bring us together. And it's not about all of us believing the same thing. It's about remembering that we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time." This time the applause came faster, stronger. People weren't just clapping, they were feeling something. A connection, a sense of purpose. A reminder that no matter what struggles they faced, they weren't climbing alone. Trump let the applause settle before leaning in one last time. "So tonight," he said, "I'll leave you with this. Ask yourself what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing, even when you can't see the whole picture." A hush fell over the room once more, not out of silence, but reflection. Then, just before stepping back, Trump added one final thought. "And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it, let it grow. And most importantly, share it with the people who need it most." The applause erupted again, but this time it was punctuated with something more. Handshakes, hugs, people exchanging words, smiles, even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with nothing more than polite nods now lingered, sharing something that couldn't be seen, only felt. Ella watched it all, standing with her mother as the room came alive with connection. Then, to her surprise, Trump stepped away from the podium and walked toward her. He knelt slightly so their eyes met at the same level. "Thank you, Ella," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." Ella swallowed, then extended her small hand. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Trump shook her hand, giving her one last nod before straightening. As he turned back toward the audience, he waved, a gesture of gratitude, not just to those who came to listen, but to those who had opened their hearts. And as he exited, the room didn't just fall back into small talk and routine, it stayed alive. People didn't just walk away, they carried something with them. And as Ella stood beside her mother watching it all unfold, she whispered the words she'd been holding in her heart all night. Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she? Her mother's smile was warm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She wouldn't just be proud, sweetheart," she said softly. "She would be amazed." Final message for viewers. As the hall slowly emptied, one thing was clear. Sometimes the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't even know were missing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith. What does it mean to you? How has it shaped your life? And more importantly, who in your life might need to hear this message today? Share this story. Spread the light. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together. Because sometimes, all it takes is one question to change everything.